Hi, everyone. Welcome to our week 2 discussion where we are going to be focused on talking about sports sponsorship, specifically sports sponsorship effectiveness, and more specifically, trying to understand why sponsorship works. So when McKinley and I first started looking across the readings, that seemed like a fairly straightforward question. The idea that a company sponsors a team or an event, consumers see the brand, hopefully develop a more favorable perception of it, and then ultimately support or purchase from that sponsor, right? But as we worked through the readings, it became more clear that that process is much more complicated than that. So rather than walking through each of the 4 studies individually, we wanted to look at the theoretical stories connecting them. So today we're going to look at how consumers process sponsorship relationships, how fan identity influences those relationships, how attitudes may or may not translate into behavior, and what happens when sponsorship actually produces a negative response. So throughout the presentation, we also want to question where some of the theories that we were reading about explain sponsorship well, and then where they may not have fully captured what's happening and challenge some of those theories. So with that in mind, here is where we're headed. There are 5 things that we want to accomplish with this week's discussion. First, we'll look at major theoretical perspectives used to explain sponsorship effectiveness. Then we'll trace how those theories have been applied, refined, and extended over time. We'll also compare the theories because they're not all explaining the same thing, right? Some help us understand how consumers cognitively process sponsorship, while others are better at kind of explaining identity, behavioral intentions, or negative reactions. Most importantly, we don't want to accept the theories at face value, right? We want to kind of challenge some of those ideas. So we want to identify assumptions and limitations, and then think about where sponsorship research could go next. And then in the end, finally, we'll come back to measurement. Because knowing that someone remembers a sponsor is very different from knowing that sponsorship changed, their behavior. And that brings us to the question that guided how we approached the readings. So our big question behind all 4 readings, at the simplest level, we're asking what actually makes a sponsorship relationship effective. So the traditional version of this process is fairly linear, right? Consumers are exposed to the sponsor, they become aware of the brand, hopefully develop a favorable attitude, and then that eventually leads to purchase intention or behavior. When I think of this, I think about seeing the Nike logo repeated everywhere while watching a sporting event, right? You notice the brand, begin associating it with the event or athletes you enjoy, develop a more favorable view of Nike. I've certainly been there. And then that may eventually influence you to choose Nike the next time you're buying athletic gear. But once we kind of put the readings together, McKinley and I, we noticed way more variables kind of appear. So, for example, Gwinner and Eaton in that reading, it kind of focused on sponsor event fit and image transfer, whereas Dees and colleagues looked at goodwill and fan involvement. Biscaya and colleagues add team loyalty, awareness, sponsor attitude, and purchase intention. And then Weimer and colleagues just completely complicate the picture by showing that sponsor-related communication can actually generate negative reactions from fans, which I thought that was a really interesting take to read about. So ultimately, the question that we kept coming back to was whether sponsorship effectiveness is really one simple linear process, or whether it's, a dynamic relationship between the fan, the sport property, and the sponsor. So we arranged the readings chronologically, and when we do that, we notice that you can see kind of the complexity of these ideas kind of developing. When we take a look at how the readings build on one another, we organize the readings this way because they almost tell a story about how sponsorship research has evolved over time. So with Gwinner and Eaton, they give us a foundation for thinking about image transfer, right? How meanings associated with a sporting event can become connected to a sponsoring brand, and role fit plays in strengthening that transfer. Now, Dees and colleagues, they move us further towards the consumer by looking at attitude towards the sponsor, goodwill, fan involvement, and purchase intentions. One major finding was that goodwill was particularly important in predicting purchase intentions. Now, Biscaya and colleagues add team loyalty and sponsorship awareness. One important finding was that simply being aware of a sponsor did not directly predict, purchase intention. Sponsor attitude played a pretty big important role. Now, Weimer and colleagues then bring us into social media and ask what happens when fans do not respond positively to sponsorship, right? And that happens all the time. So across the readings, we move from association to evaluation to behavioral attention, and then to the possibility of resistance. Now, the last piece is important because it forces us to stop assuming sponsorship exposure is inherently positive, right? More exposure is not necessarily better if consumers dislike the relationship they're being exposed to. So when I thought of this, I was thinking about sports betting sponsorships. Fans might see the same betting brand throughout an entire game. So awareness is obviously high, right? We see the sponsorship branding there. But if they feel like the sponsorship is excessive or inappropriate, all of that exposure could actually create a negative reaction. So that's a good example of why more exposure doesn't always mean a more effective sponsorship. So to understand why these responses might happen, we need several different kind of theoretical lenses as we looked at each of the 4 different readings. So for our discussion, we're organizing the presentation around 4 theoretical perspectives, right? So the first is schema theory, along with related ideas around congruence and the matchup hypothesis. So schema theory traces back to the work of Frederick Bartlett and has its roots in cognitive psychology. It helps us understand how consumers organize and process information about sponsor property relationship. Then we move into the second, which is social identity theory, right, from social psychology and primarily associated with Teifel and Turner. Now, this shifts the focus from information processing to identity, what changes when the team becomes part of how I understand who I am and who we are. The third, we bring in the theory of reasoned action and theory of planned behavior. These social psychological approaches are associated with Fishbein and Eisen, with Eisen later extending the framework into TPB. They help us think about things like attitudes, intentions, perceived control, and behavior. And then finally, balance theory. So from social psychology and associated with Fritz Heider, helps us understand psychological inconsistency, right? So thinking of things like what happens when I love my team, but I dislike the sponsor my team has chosen to associate itself with. These theories aren't necessarily competing to explain the exact same thing. They're different lenses into different parts of the sponsorship process. That's why looking at one sponsorship through only one theoretical lens can leave important parts of the process unexplained. So we'll start with the cognitive side of the process and schema theory.
Hi, y'all. I'm McKinley Crone, and I'm going to be continuing on this topic a little bit. So, schema theory gives us the foundation for understanding how consumers process sponsorship relationships right off the bat, which has roots in cognitive psychology and has developed through the work of multiple scholars examining how knowledge is mentally organized. Frederick Bartlett's 1932 work on remembering is commonly identified as an important early foundation for the concept of schemas. And for our purposes, we're especially interested in how Gwinner and Eaton apply schema-based processing to sponsorship. So that's a lot of names thrown at you, and the basic idea behind it all is that basically we don't encounter brands or sporting events with a blank slate. We bring our existing mental structures and associations from previous experiences. So, for example, if I mention a familiar brand, you probably have some kind of association with it already. For example, if I say Nike or Adidas or Gatorade, you probably have some athlete or video or something associated that reminds you of those brands. The same is true for a team, a league, athlete, or event, right? The Chicago Bulls, probably Michael Jordan. The New England Patriots, probably Tom Brady. The Indiana Fever, probably Caitlin Clark. Right? When a sponsor is connected to a sport property, consumers have to integrate those sets of associations that they already have. And so this is where we see schema theory becoming really important in their article, which is when information about these two entities is congruent, it's easier to process and incorporate that into existing schemas. So instead of saying, did I see the sponsor? Now we're asking, does this relationship make sense based on what I already believe about these two entities? And so, whether these two entities make sense together is going to lead us into sponsor event fit, which we're now going to unpack more under their article. And so, Gwinner and Eaton take these ideas about schemas and congruence and apply them to a bigger picture through event sponsorship. The argument is that characteristics associated with an event can become associated with the sponsoring brand, but they wanted to know whether the similarity between the event and the sponsor would make that transfer stronger. Right? They distinguish this functional similarity with image similarity. Functional similarity exists when the sponsor's product is used or could logically be used within the event. Image similarity is more symbolic, right? The sponsor and the event share similar meanings or image characteristics. In their article, the authors found that the stronger image transfer, when either they found there was a stronger image transfer when either functional similarity or image similarity existed compared to when there was no similarity condition. So ultimately, we have to realize that we can't just stop at, oh, this fit works, right? We have to start questioning the concept of saying when two organizations fit, who gets to decide which is what? And so the question becomes more interesting when we look at how later research has refined the concept of fit. This is our first example of how later research has refined rather than simply repeated an earlier theoretical idea. Gwinner and Eaton already distinguish functional similarity from image similarity. So even the earlier work suggests that fit isn't just one singular concept. Right? Later sponsorship research has continued to make those distinctions. For example, Graeber and Scheinbaum's 2022 jersey sponsorship research examined different forms of congruence and found that they didn't necessarily lead to identical consumer outcomes. Functional fit produced stronger purchase intentions than schema-based congruence did in their study. So now the question is shifting a bit. Instead of asking, does the sponsor fit the sport properly? We're now thinking maybe we should be asking what type of fit exists? How is the consumer interpreting it? And what are we trying to get out of this? Right? There's also another issue is that fit may not be one thing and one thing alone. It's not necessarily static, right? A sponsorship that seems unusual initially could really become normalized through repeated exposure or meaningful activity, while a once logical partnership could become problematic if the organization's image shifts or changes or moves away from what that original partnership fit was. So now I want to ask, can future fits change? Can they shift over time, right? Can a fit mean one thing at the start and then eventually move to something else? And I would say yes, it can, based off of what we know from these articles. It's saying that yes, fit can evolve with what the brand's demands and needs are. And so now things are starting to get a little complicated, and that we consider that fans aren't just looking at brands in a cognitive sense, right? They're taking so much more into it. Like, for example, social identity theory. Social identity theory gives us a different explanation for sponsorship response. Whereas on one hand, schema theory helps us understand the information processing, Social identity theory asks what happens when membership in a group becomes part of how someone defines themselves. This theory comes from a social psychology and is primarily associated with Henry Tajfel and John Turner. And sorry if I butchered the names there. In sport, this matters because highly identified fans don't often talk about a team as simply something as they watch. They say, we won, we lost. I'm an Alabama grad, and I can tell you that when Nick Saban won those national championships, we won those national championships, right? When we didn't make the playoffs a couple years ago, we were having a terrible season. And so there's this shift from this team did this and they did this to, okay, we're doing this. And it's theoretically important to note. Dees and his colleagues draw on the social identity theory when discussing highly involved fans, right? Highly involved fans may behave in ways that reinforce their relationship within the group. Instead, we're saying now, okay, supporting a sponsor may potentially become another way of essentially supporting the team. Right? This theoretical tradition was later extended through self-categorization theory, which further developed the cognitive side of how people categorize themselves as members of social groups. Here's our challenge. Could the same identification that makes sponsorship so powerful also make it risky, right? If this team is part of who I am at my core, I might support companies that generally support that team. But I also may be protective when I think a sponsor doesn't belong. Okay, here's an example. If I, again, am an Alabama fan and I know that that team sponsors Auburn or that company is sponsoring Auburn, I sure as heck don't want to buy from them, right? So now, okay, we're looking at more than just the sponsorship, that fan identity amplifies positive and negative responses. And so in Dees and his colleagues, they studied this sponsorship effectiveness as in an elite intercollegiate football program and examined three major predictors of purchase intentions, which was attitude toward the sponsor, goodwill, and fan involvement. And all three were significant predictors. Together, they explained about 63% of the variance in purchase intentions. But the finding that stood out the most to us was goodwill, right? Goodwill gets at the idea that fans recognize sponsors as providing support to something that they care about, right? We're talking about, okay, now this affects me personally, right? This relationship isn't just necessarily, I saw the logo, so I might buy it, right? It became, you support something that's important to me, so I feel more positively about you. In their model, goodwill had the strongest relationship with purchase intentions. And so now it raises another question. Does goodwill automatically come from the act of sponsorship, right? Is writing a check or putting your logo on something just enough for consumers to perceive genuine support? Or does that sponsorship really have to feel authentic? An interesting cross-reading connection that Dees identifies awareness and image transfer as areas as needing further research. And so that's where some of the newer research becomes especially useful. That goodwill is not just the same as simple visibility. And so we're going to see that transition in some of the newer research.
Now, the question about goodwill led us to more recent sponsorship research. So going back, Dee showed that goodwill can predict purchase intention, right? But that leaves us with a question about how goodwill actually develops. So we were thinking about things like, does a consumer automatically give a company credit because it sponsors something they care about? Or do consumers evaluate how the sponsor is supporting that property? So one study that helped us think about this was Asada and colleagues' 2023 research on CSR-linked sports sponsorship. CSR-linked sponsorship is when a company connects its sports sponsorship to a broader social or community cause. So keep thinking about Nike. But for example, imagine Nike sponsoring a youth sports program, right? And that provides free equipment or participation opportunities for underserved communities. The study showed that simply connecting a sponsorship to a socially responsible cause wasn't automatically beneficial, right? If consumers perceive that the sponsor wasn't genuinely committed to the cause, it could actually hurt their perception of how well the sponsor fit with it. On the other hand, right, greater perceived commitment led to stronger perceptions of fit and more favorable outcomes. So, again, it's not just about being associated with a good cause. That's not enough. It's about whether consumers believe the relationship is genuine and actually makes sense. I think this adds an important layer to the goodwill argument. Maybe goodwill isn't simply a consequence of sponsorship. Maybe it actually has to be earned. And one way we might extend the earlier model is to think about perceived authenticity or commitment as something that shapes whether sponsorship produces goodwill. But I want to make one distinction here. Assad and colleagues specifically examined perceived sponsor commitment, not authenticity as a measured construct. So authenticity is our broader theoretical interpretation of what that finding might mean for goodwill. So we're proposing that an extension based on the literature, not claiming that these or Asana directly tested sponsorship authenticity. But even when sponsorship produces goodwill and favorable attitudes, positive attitudes don't necessarily equal behavior. A true theory extension, or TRA, to theory of planned behavior, or TPB. This gives us one of kind of the clearest examples this week of an actual development from an earlier theory. The theory of reasoned action associated with Fishbein and Eisen was developed to explain the relationship among beliefs, attitudes, intention, and behavior. One central idea from that is that behavioral intention is an important precursor to behavior. Now, Eisen later extended that framework into the theory of planned behavior. The major addition here was perceived behavioral control. That matters because we can have every intention of doing something and still encounter circumstances that make the behavior difficult or impossible, right? So for example, I might fully intend to purchase from a sponsor, but maybe the product isn't available where I live. It's too expensive or I don't need it. Suddenly, intention and behavior aren't the same thing. Biscaya and colleagues draw on the theory of planned behavior when discussing sponsor attitude and behavioral intentions. I think this is useful because purchase intention is one of the most common sponsorship effectiveness measurements. But if our theory ultimately seeks to explain behavior and our research stops at intention, are we actually measuring the outcome we're trying to explain, right? So Biscaya gives us a good example of why the steps between awareness, attitude, and intention actually matter. Biscaya and colleagues examined sponsorship in professional football and looked at relationship among team loyalty, sponsorship awareness, attitude towards a sponsor, and purchase intention. And now there are many relationships in their model, but one result that's especially important was, awareness did not directly predict purchase intention for either sponsor. So, instead, awareness influenced purchase intention indirectly through attitude towards the sponsor, and sponsor attitude was the strongest predictor of purchase intention. So imagine, I can walk into a stadium and correctly identify every sponsor on the scoreboard. That tells us that the sponsorship succeeded in creating awareness. It doesn't tell us whether I like those companies. It definitely doesn't tell us whether I'm ever going to buy anything from them. So Biscaya kind of helps us separate something that can easily get collapsed in sponsorship evaluation, right? Visibility is an outcome, but visibility isn't necessarily effectiveness, or at least it isn't the whole definition of effectiveness. So once we make that distinction, it raises a bigger question about how effectiveness is actually being measured. Challenge number 3. Are we measuring effectiveness too early? This was one of the biggest questions that came out of the readings for McKinley and I. This idea that sponsorship can potentially produce a sequence of outcomes: exposure, recall, attitude, intention, behavior, and ultimately some type of long term relationship. But those aren't interchangeable measures, right? So if someone remembers my brand, I've learned something about awareness. If they report liking my brand, I've learned something about attitude. If they say they intend to purchase, I've learned something about behavioral intention. But none of those measures necessarily tells me whether a purchase actually occurred. Biscaya and colleagues acknowledge this limitation themselves, right? Purchase intentions are not the same as actual purchasing behavior. So maybe the issue isn't that awareness or purchase intention are bad measures, because they aren't. I think the problem comes when we treat one measure as though it represents, sponsorship effectiveness as a whole. Um, so far, we've mostly discussed positive outcomes, but our final theoretical perspective forces us to consider the opposite possibility. What happens when the relationship doesn't fit? So, balance theory helps us look at what happens when those relationships don't align, right? The basic idea is that people generally prefer consistency among their attitudes. So, again, imagine I have a strong, positive relationship with my favorite team, but I have a negative attitude towards one of its sponsors, right? We used this example before. That creates an imbalance. Now I have two conflicting evaluations within the same relationship. Now, what I think is interesting is how the consumer resolves that tension, right? So, ideas like, does my connection to the team eventually make me view the sponsor more positively? Do my negative feelings towards the sponsor affect how I evaluate the partnership? Or could they even influence how I feel about the team? So I just think that adds another layer to our discussion of sponsorship effectiveness, right? It's not enough for the sponsor to simply be visible or associated with a popular property. We also have to consider existing attitudes consumers bring into that relationship, and then what happens when those attitudes conflict. Weimar gives us evidence that sponsor related communication can produce exactly the kind of negative response balance theory leads us to consider.
So, continuing on with Weimar's and their colleagues, they take us into a very different sponsorship environment. They analyzed more than 4,600 Facebook posts from all 18 Bundesliga clubs and examined how fans reacted to different types of club generated content, including their sponsor related posts. What makes this study useful is that they aren't starting with the assumption that sponsorship exposure produces a positive response. In fact, sponsor related posts performed worse than in the terms of overall reactions and shares, and were associated with a greater proportion of negative reactions. The authors use balance theory to help explain why did this happen, right? If I have a strong positive relationship with my club, but perceive that the sponsor is more negative, or I feel that commercial content doesn't fit with what I expect from my club, right? That relationship can create a psychological imbalance, right? I really love my club and I feel this need to draw to them and I want to support them, but also they're supporting something that I don't really associate with at my core. I'm kind of torn here. What do I do? And so something else really stood out in this is that context really played a big role as well, right? The way that these sponsorships were communicated, including the media and the medium and the timing, right? This influenced the fan reactions. Right, it suggests that we can evaluate a sponsorship relationship independently from how it's activated, right? There's a logo on a scoreboard, a sponsor funding a community initiative, right? A sponsor heavy social media post, right? They're all different sponsorship activations, but from the consumer's perspective, they can be completely different experiences, which is what led us to the next model on this slide, right? After putting all four readings together and with a little extra research, this is kind of where we landed, right? Rather than thinking about sponsorship as a straight line from exposure to awareness to purchase, right? We think it's going to be more useful to conceptualize sponsorship as an ongoing relationship among with the three parties, which are the sport property, the fan, and the sponsor. Surrounding that relationships are factors like fit, fan identity, authenticity, activation, and context. These are all factors that are going to influence how does this consumer interpret the relationship that a brand has with a sponsorship. Schema and congruence perspectives help explain whether the relationship makes sense. Social identity theory helps explain why the sport property relationship may carry strong personal meaning. Behavioral theories help us understand movement from attitudes toward intentions and potential behavior. And balance theory helps us explain what happens when those relationships kind of become inconsistent, right? Importantly, the outcome doesn't have to be positive. We could see awareness, goodwill, favorable attitudes, engagement, and behavior, but also skepticism or perceived incongruence, anger, disengagement, or conflict with the fan's relationship to the property. We want to be so clear here, this isn't an established theoretical model. We're claiming to have empirically tested it. It's our synthesis of what we see happening across literature, but it raises the possibility that sponsorship effectiveness may be better understood as a dynamic relationship rather than a single sequence of consumer responses. Thinking about sponsorship in this way helped us identify places where existing theories may be lacking or just incomplete. We came away with three areas that we think deserve more attention. First is that fit may be dynamic. A sponsorship that feels strange when a partnership is announced could become accepted over time through repeated exposure or meaningful activation. And the reverse could happen if the sponsor's image changes. Second, fan identity may work in both directions. These gives us reason to expect highly involved fans to support organizations connected to their team. But Weimer makes us wonder whether that same identification could make fans more protective of the property when sponsorship feels intrusive. And that's not something that these studies directly test together. It's a question that emerges when we put their findings in conversation with one another. Third is context is still under theorized. Sponsorship research can talk broadly about exposure or activation, but consumers encounter sponsorship in a very different environment each time. So the question should increasingly become not only who sponsors whom, but where and how and under what conditions consumers encounter that relationship. And so these limitations that we previously discussed naturally kind of point towards these opportunities for future research. And so, based on the limitations and the theoretical questions that we've identified, several directions seem fairly interesting. And one of those is moving beyond purchase intentions towards actual behavior and the long-term outcomes. Another is treating fit as something that may change over time rather than just saying, okay, here's the one and done and assuming it's stable and we're good to go. We also think that context deserves a lot more attention. A lot of the foundational sponsorship research that was conducted was in a fairly specific sport setting. And so we'd like to see more comparison over women's sports, college athletics, community sport, and youth or high school athletics, as well as different fan populations, right? The people that are going to a NBA game are a lot different than the people that are going to a WNBA game or even an NWSL game. The digital environment creates another opportunity. social media, streaming, right? Athlete created content and other digital platforms give sponsors access to fans in ways that a lot of these foundational theories, when they were created, they didn't have access to this because they didn't exist. And so the research question that I particularly find really interesting is that like we know sponsorship can change the perceptions of the sponsor, but under what conditions does the sponsor also change how consumers then perceive the sport property itself? These research questions have these practical implications for people managing sponsorship relationships.
So applying these different ideas, thinking about what should sport managers and sponsors do differently. I think from a managerial perspective, these studies ultimately just challenge the idea that sponsorship success is simply about maximizing exposure. Um, First, organizations need to really think about fit, okay? Not just whether the partnership looks logical internally, but how consumers will actually interpret that relationship. I think the second thing they should think about is sponsors probably have to do the work to earn goodwill. Visibility alone doesn't necessarily communicate genuine support. Um, Third, organizations need broader measurement. If we're only reporting things like impressions or logo exposure or sponsor recall, we may be missing, the more important question of how fans actually feel and behave in response to the partnership. So maybe the goal isn't, maximum visibility. Maybe it's meaningful and credible visibility. So that brings us to the major takeaways that we want to leave you all with. All right, so let's bring it all together. If we reduce everything that we've covered to, a few major takeaways, the first takeaway that we want you guys to know or to think about is that sponsorship effectiveness is multidimensional. Awareness matters, but awareness isn't attitude. Attitude isn't intention, and intention isn't behavior, right? They're not interchangeable. Second, fit matters, but fit is more complicated than simply saying two organizations match, right? There's other variables that we need to think about with that. Third, takeaway is that fan identity makes sports sponsorship particularly powerful, but potentially more complicated as well.
Fourth, the sponsorship can create negative value, which means organizations have to like really pay attention to resistance and negative fan reactions and not just the positives. And finally, no single theory that we've discussed completely explains and covers sponsorship effectiveness, right? Schema theory helps us with cognition. Social identity theory helps us with the identity of things. How do I feel about a specific team? Behavioral theory helps us with the intentions and behavior, of course. And balance theory helps us understand the conflict and inconsistency. So, after reviewing all of this research, we think that the better question is not simply just does sponsorship work, but that who does it work for, right? Under what conditions, through what mechanisms, and again, for what purpose? These questions lead directly into the two questions that we want everyone here to think about.
All right, so next steps, and in conclusion, let's talk about our discussion questions for this week. So for our discussion, we wanted questions that require us to actually apply and challenge the theories rather than just kind of restate what the readings found. So question number one, strong team identification is usually treated as an advantage for sponsors. Under what conditions might highly identified fans become actually more resistant to a sponsor, and which theory from this week best explains that response? By highly identified fans, we're referring to fans who feel a very strong personal connection to a team, right? Their fandom is more than casually liking or watching the team, but the team is, a part of their identity and their sense of belonging. We're especially interested in whether you think identity always strengthens sponsorship or whether it could, sometimes amplify negative responses.
And so the second question we have is that if awareness and purchase intention don't necessarily equal actual behavior, how should sport organizations define and measure sponsorship effectiveness, right? What outcomes do you prioritize and why? So for this one, we're really interested in what you would actually measure if you were responsible for determining whether a sponsorship was worth continuing. And we're looking forward to hearing everybody's perspectives and seeing how you apply the different theoretical frameworks. Thanks.